My husband sneered across the restaurant table, telling me to stop living off his hard-earned money. I said absolutely nothing in response. Weeks later, everything he relied on suddenly vanished into thin air. His credit card stopped working. The refrigerator was completely empty and the power company shut off the lights. He turned pale and demanded to know what I did. I simply smiled and told him I did exactly what he asked. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to shrink yourself to protect the fragile ego of a toxic man, because the way I dismantled my husband's entire existence is going to be your new favorite playbook. My name is Nora, and I am 33 years old. For 5 long years, I played the role of the quiet and quirky freelance interior decorator, married to the hotshot director of sales Bradley. We were sitting at an upscale French restaurant in downtown Chicago, supposedly celebrating our 5th wedding anniversary. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the dining room, and soft jazz played in the background. But it was not just the two of us. Bradley had invited his mother Brenda because, according to him, she was the one who raised the man who provided for me, so she deserved to celebrate too. The waiter approached our table with a sleek black leather folder and gently placed it down. The total was nearly $900. Bradley picked it up, glanced at the number, and then threw it directly onto my lap. The heavy leather slapped against my silk dress. "You pay for it," he said, taking a slow, arrogant sip of his expensive bourbon. I stared at him, keeping my face completely neutral, and asked him to repeat himself. "You heard me," Bradley said, his voice raising just enough for the affluent couples at the tables next to us to turn their heads and stare. "I am sick of carrying your dead weight, Nora. You sit at home all day picking out throw pillows and paint swatches for pennies while I break my back in the corporate world to afford this lifestyle. Stop living off me. This meal, the dress you are wearing, the car you drove here in is all me." Brenda, who had been quietly eating her dessert, wiped her mouth with a linen napkin and smirked. "He is right, Nora. I told Bradley years ago that marrying a woman without a real career or a trust fund was going to drain him dry. You should be immensely grateful he even brought you to a place with valet parking. A woman of your background could never afford to step foot in here alone." I did not cry. I did not cause a scene to give them the satisfaction they desperately craved. I did not even argue back. I just looked at Bradley's smug face. He was waiting for me to apologize, to beg, to remind him that my freelance checks barely covered our weekly groceries. He wanted to feel like a powerful king holding the purse strings of my life. So I reached into my clutch, pulled out the sleek, heavy metal credit card with his name printed on it, and placed it right on top of the bill. "You are absolutely right, Bradley," I said, my voice dangerously calm and steady. "I have been relying on this setup for far too long. I think it is time I stop using your money. From tomorrow morning onward, we will be entirely financially independent from each other." Bradley let out a loud bark of laughter, tossing his napkin onto the table with a dramatic flourish. "Good luck with that, sweetheart. You will not last a single week without my paycheck paying your way through life." What Bradley did not know, and what nobody in his arrogant, entitled family knew, was the true nature of my little decorating gig. I was not just picking out paint swatches for middle-class living rooms. I was the silent owner and chief executive officer of Vanguard, a commercial supply chain company that sourced high-end materials for corporate high-rises across the nation. I was making 7 figures a year in clear profit. But I had kept it completely hidden, funneling my wealth into a private trust to protect myself from Bradley's reckless and impulsive spending habits. He honestly thought he was the sole provider, but my hidden corporate trust was actually paying off the massive debts he racked up on his luxury car leases and custom-tailored suits. The prestigious black card I had just put on the table was tied to my corporate account, not his personal bank account. He was an authorized user on my dime, and he did not even realize it. I stood up from the table, gracefully smoothing down my dress. "Happy anniversary, Bradley. I will see you at home." As I walked out of the elegant restaurant, leaving my husband and his mother to pay the massive bill with the card I had just authorized for the very last time, A cold, calculated sense of peace washed over my entire body. He wanted financial independence. I was going to give it to him in the most brutal way possible. But first, I was going to cut every single invisible safety net I had secretly placed under him to keep his perfect life afloat. He was about to learn a very hard lesson about who was actually supporting who. The next morning, I woke up to find a spreadsheet printed and slammed directly onto the kitchen island. Bradley stood by the coffee maker wearing his custom-tailored suit, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He tapped the paper aggressively, telling me since I wanted to be an independent woman, here was my reality check. He drafted a strict roommate agreement. He announced we were splitting everything down the middle, 50-50. The mortgage, the homeowners association fees, the electricity, the water, the groceries, and the landscaping costs. He pointed to the bottom line, highlighting that my half came out to exactly $4,250 a month, due on the 1st without exception. He crossed his arms, waiting for the panic to set in. He knew my freelance bank account, the decoy one he accessed, only ever showed about $2,000. He desperately wanted me to break down and cry. He wanted me to admit I needed his financial rescue. I picked up the paper, grabbed a pen, and signed my name in bold ink without breaking eye contact. I pushed the contract back across the marble island and told him it was done. Bradley's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He accused me of bluffing and threatened that if I missed a single payment, he would legally evict me. I simply told him his threat was noted as I calmly poured myself a cup of black coffee. I reminded him that since we were now splitting things 50-50, I was no longer managing the household bills for him. He would need to set up his own auto pay for his half of the utilities. I also mentioned his expensive country club membership. Since that was his networking tool for his corporate job, I assumed he would be covering that entirely on his own. He scoffed loudly, saying, of course he would, because he was the one who made the real money. Right on cue, the doorbell rang. It was Bradley's sister Olivia and her husband, Jamal. Jamal was a brilliant African-American man working as a senior auditor for a top accounting firm. He was quiet, sharply observant, and the only person in Bradley's entire family I actually respected. Jamal always looked like he was mentally calculating the tax fraud happening around him whenever my mother-in-law spoke. Olivia walked in loudly, announcing they brought fresh bagels from downtown, and dropped her designer bag onto my pristine sofa. She immediately looked at Bradley and said their mother told her all about last night. She congratulated him on finally putting his foot down, saying it was about time he stopped letting me drag him down. Jamal shot me an apologetic look. He walked into the kitchen and set the bakery box down next to the morning mail Bradley had tossed aside. Jamal's trained eyes instantly landed on a thick envelope from the county tax assessor's office. He casually asked Bradley a question. He said he thought Bradley bought this place under his own name before we got married. Bradley puffed out his chest, proudly confirming that he did, claiming he put the down payment down completely by himself. Jamal frowned slightly, tapping the envelope with his index finger. He asked why the property tax assessment was addressed to a corporate entity named N. Vanguard, LLC. He pointed out that usually meant the house was owned by a corporate trust and not an individual. The kitchen went dead silent for a moment. Bradley looked confused and quickly snatched the envelope away from Jamal's hands. He brushed it off, saying it was just the bank's property management company, claiming it was standard practice for luxury mortgages. He rudely told Jamal not to bore everyone with his accounting paranoia. Jamal did not push the issue further, but his eyes met mine over the kitchen island. A subtle, sharp look of realization flickered across his face. Jamal knew exactly what a limited liability company was. He knew banks did not hide private mortgages behind them, unless the actual owner requested total anonymity. I gave Jamal a tiny knowing smile, secretly acknowledging his sharp observation while silently telling him not to ruin my ultimate surprise just yet. As Olivia continued to complain loudly about the lack of decent hired help in our area, I pulled out my phone beneath the marble counter. I opened my encrypted messaging app and texted my wealth manager. I instructed him to execute Phase 1 immediately. I told him to remove Bradley from the shadow payroll and cancel his black card without warning. Bradley thought he was cutting me off. He did not realize he had just handed me the very scissors I needed to permanently sever his only remaining financial lifeline for good. After sliding my phone back into my pocket, I returned my attention to the kitchen island. Olivia was still aggressively complaining about her housekeeper while Bradley chewed his bagel with a self-satisfied smirk on his face. He truly believed he had just checkmated me. He thought the 50-50 roommate contract was a brilliant masterstroke that would force me to crawl back to him, begging for financial mercy. He had absolutely no idea the ground beneath his feet had already evaporated. A few minutes later, Olivia demanded that they leave so she could make her afternoon spa appointment. As she marched toward the front door to reapply her lipstick in the hallway mirror, Jamal lingered behind in the kitchen. He began gathering the empty coffee mugs and bringing them to the sink. It was an excuse to get close to me without Bradley noticing. Bradley was too busy admiring his own reflection in the microwave glass to pay attention to us. Jamal turned on the faucet and leaned in close, keeping his voice low enough so only I could hear. He told me he knew what I was doing. He said Vanguard LLC was a very clever name. He pointed out that the letter N obviously stood for Nora, and Vanguard meant the forefront of an advancing army. He looked me dead in the eyes and asked if I owned the house. I carefully took a sponge from the sink and began wiping down the marble counter. I did not give him a direct answer, but I did not lie either. I simply looked up at him and told him he had always been the smartest man in this entire family. I advised him that when the storm finally hit, he should make sure he was standing very far away from Bradley and Olivia. I warned him that the collateral damage was going to be extensive, and I did not want him getting caught in the crossfire. Jamal slowly nodded his expression, turning serious and respectful. He dried his hands on a towel and whispered that he would keep his mouth shut. He told me to give them hell before turning around and walking out to join his loud and obnoxious wife. That brief exchange cemented my respect for Jamal. He was sharp enough to see the truth, but wise enough to let the consequences unfold naturally. Once they left the house, Bradley strutted into the living room wearing his expensive golf attire. He grabbed his keys and announced he was heading to the prestigious Oakwood Country Club to play 18 holes with some high-net-worth clients. He adjusted his collar and arrogantly reminded me about our new arrangement. He told me not to touch the premium steaks in the refrigerator because he bought them with his own money and they were strictly for his meals. I smiled warmly and assured him I would not dream of touching his food. I told him to have a wonderful time at the club. He grabbed his golf clubs and walked out the door, hopping into his luxury leased sports car. I stood by the front window watching him pull out of the driveway. He looked so incredibly confident. He looked like a man who had the entire world sitting in the palm of his hand. As soon as his car disappeared down the street, I walked straight to my home office and locked the door behind me. I opened my laptop and logged into the highly secure Vanguard corporate banking portal. My wealth manager had already executed Phase 1 just as I requested. I spent the next hour meticulously reviewing the dashboard to ensure every single hidden safety net was entirely dismantled. For the past 5 years, I had been quietly funding Bradley's lavish lifestyle through a complex web of automated transfers. Every time he overspent on his personal credit cards, my trust account automatically cleared the balance, so his credit score remained perfect. When he leased his ridiculous sports car, I paid the massive down payment through a dummy corporation. He genuinely believed his salary covered his lifestyle because he never bothered to look at the math. His ego blinded him to the basic reality of his own finances. I systematically clicked through the portal, turning off every automated payment. I canceled the invisible overdraft protection on his checking account. I severed the corporate tie to his black card, rendering it completely useless plastic. I stopped the ghost deposits that artificially inflated his monthly income. By the time I closed my laptop, Bradley was completely financially exposed for the very first time in his adult life. The trap was set, and all I had to do was wait for him to swipe that card at the country club. My phone buzzed loudly on the wooden desk, breaking the quiet stillness of my home office. It was a secure encrypted message from my chief financial officer, David. He was a brilliant and ruthless numbers guy who had helped me build N Vanguard from the ground up. His text was brief and straight to the point. All secondary authorizations have been officially revoked. The ghost accounts are completely drained and permanently closed. He is flying totally blind. I typed back a simple thank you and locked my phone screen. Sitting back in my ergonomic leather chair, I let out a long, heavy breath. For a brief moment, my mind drifted back to exactly why I had set up those ridiculous financial safety nets in the first place. It was not out of blinding love or naive wifely devotion. It was pure survival. 3 years ago, Bradley had nearly bankrupted us trying to impress a group of senior executives by buying a luxury boat he absolutely could not afford. The bank had called me directly because my name was somehow listed as a secondary guarantor on his highly questionable loan application. Instead of confronting him and dealing with the explosive gaslighting that would inevitably follow, I quietly paid off the entire loan through my corporate trust and restructured our entire financial existence. I essentially built a hidden financial firewall around him. I set up automated transfers that dropped $2,500 into his checking account on the 15th of every single month. I labeled the transfer as an executive performance bonus from his employer. His massive ego never even allowed him to question the sudden influx of cash. He just assumed he was naturally that spectacular at his corporate job. I also secretly took over the massive monthly payments for his leased Porsche because he was 3 months behind and the dealership was threatening immediate repossession. Every time he mocked my freelance decorating gig, he was literally standing in clothes. I paid for driving a car. I saved from the repo man. The most satisfying cut of all was severing the direct deposit to his mother, Brenda. Bradley loved playing the big shot son. He proudly sent her $1,000 a month for her personal allowance. But what Brenda and Bradley both failed to realize was that Bradley's actual salary barely covered his own custom-tailored suits and expensive weekend golf habits. That monthly $1,000 allowance came directly out of my corporate dividend yield. I logged into the banking portal one last time and completely deleted Brenda's routing number from the system. I smiled brightly, imagining the exact look on her face when her upcoming spa day check bounced due to insufficient funds. The afternoon sun began to stream heavily through the large office windows. I stood up and walked straight into our massive walk-in closet. Since we were now living under a strict 50-50 roommate agreement, I decided to take an inventory of my personal investments. Bradley had a massive collection of high-end luxury watches displayed in a velvet-lined case. He loved to brag to his friends about his incredible taste in expensive timepieces. I calmly unlocked the glass case and removed 3 luxury watches. I had purchased every single one of them as anniversary and birthday gifts through my corporate account. Since he explicitly stated that everything he wore was bought with his own money, I figured he would not mind if I secured my own investments. I placed the watches inside my hidden wall safe and locked it tight. I walked downstairs to the kitchen and poured the remaining premium coffee down the sink drain. If he wanted to drink expensive imported coffee, he could buy it himself. I opened the large stainless steel refrigerator and methodically removed all the high-end organic groceries I had purchased with my own money earlier that week. I packed them neatly into insulated bags. I left behind exactly what Bradley had purchased with his own debit card over the last month. Half a bottle of stale mustard, a 6-pack of cheap beer, and a single shriveled lemon. He drafted a ridiculous roommate contract, demanding 50-50, but he completely forgot I stocked the shelves. I wiped down the counter, leaving the kitchen absolutely spotless. I glanced at the digital clock on the stove. It was exactly 1:30 in the afternoon. Bradley usually finished his 18 holes of golf by 2:00. After that, he always took his wealthy clients straight to the country club dining room for a lavish 3-course lunch and a round of expensive scotch. I picked up my car keys and walked out the front door, locking it securely behind me. The timer was officially ticking down to 0. While I drove downtown to check my commercial property, Bradley held court on the pristine greens of the Oakwood Country Club. He hosted 3 wealthy clients from a tech firm. He believed closing deals required lavish displays of wealth. He purposefully lost a few holes to stroke their egos while boasting about his luxury lifestyle. He casually mentioned his expensive house, his sports car, and his ability to provide for a wife who dabbled in design for fun. His clients ate it up, unaware the man buying their time stood on a financial trapdoor. After finishing the 18th hole, Bradley led the group into the exclusive mahogany dining room. He requested his favorite table right by the massive windows overlooking the golf course. He was in his element. He snapped his fingers, summoning the waiter, and ordered a round of the most expensive aged scotch behind the bar. He insisted everyone order the dry-aged Wagyu steaks. The clients chuckled, appropriately impressed by his generous hospitality. Bradley leaned back in his leather chair, feeling like the undisputed king of the corporate world. He spent the next hour making bold promises about his company's supply chain capabilities, completely oblivious to the fact that I actually controlled those very supply chains. When the plates were finally cleared and the glasses were empty, the waiter discreetly placed a leather folio containing the check on the table. The total came out to just over $1,500. Bradley did not even look at the itemized receipt. He wanted to project absolute financial dominance. With a practiced flick of his wrist, he pulled out the heavy metal black card and dropped it onto the small silver tray. He continued laughing at a joke one of the clients was telling, not giving the transaction a second thought. The waiter picked up the folio and disappeared toward the manager's station. Exactly 10 minutes passed. 10 minutes. Then a full 15. Bradley's clients were starting to check their expensive watches, hinting that they needed to get back to their offices. Bradley looked around the dining room, feeling a slight twinge of irritation. He hated being kept waiting, especially when he was trying to look important. Finally, the waiter returned. However, he did not have the receipt and a pen. He was accompanied by the country club general manager, a stern-looking man named Harrison. Harrison approached the table and leaned in close, speaking in a hushed and discreet tone. He politely asked Bradley if he could speak with him privately for a moment in the hallway. Bradley let out a loud, dramatic sigh, rolling his eyes at his clients as if this was just a minor inconvenience caused by incompetent staff. He excused himself and followed Harrison out of the dining room into a quiet corridor. Bradley crossed his arms and demanded to know what the problem was. He reminded Harrison that he was one of their most prominent members. Harrison maintained a perfectly professional expression, but his eyes were entirely unsympathetic. He held out the metal black card and informed Bradley that the payment had been declined. Bradley immediately scoffed, claiming that was completely impossible. He aggressively told Harrison to run the card again, insisting there must be a glitch in the country club payment system. He bragged that the card had no preset spending limit and told the manager he was making a massive mistake. Harrison did not flinch. He calmly explained that they had already run the card 3 separate times. He also stated that because the decline code was unusual, he took the liberty of calling the concierge line for the credit card issuer to resolve the issue for a valued member. Harrison looked directly into Bradley's eyes and delivered the fatal blow. He said the issuer informed them that the card was permanently deactivated. He explained that Bradley was only listed as an authorized user on the account, and the primary account holder, Nora Vanguard, had officially revoked his privileges and closed the sub-account entirely. The color instantly drained from Bradley's face. His jaw went slack, and his arrogant posture completely collapsed. He stared at the piece of useless metal in Harrison's hand, as if it had suddenly caught fire. The words primary account holder echoed loudly in his empty head. He frantically patted his pockets, searching for his personal debit card, but quickly realized his own checking account only had a few $100s in it. He was standing in one of the most exclusive clubs in the entire city, with a massive lunch bill, 3 highly important corporate clients waiting for him inside, and absolutely no way to pay. Harrison crossed his arms politely and simply asked him how exactly he would like to settle the outstanding balance today. I do not know exactly how Bradley managed to escape the humiliating situation at the Oakwood Country Club. I can only assume he had to grovel and beg one of his wealthy tech clients to cover the massive lunch bill. What I do know is that less than an hour later, the front door of our house flew open with such violent force that the heavy brass handle dented the hallway drywall. Bradley stormed into the foyer, his face completely purple with pure, unadulterated rage. He looked absolutely unhinged. His expensive golf shirt was soaked with nervous sweat, and his chest was heaving as he frantically searched the first floor for me. I was sitting comfortably on the living room sofa reading an architectural magazine and enjoying a tall glass of sparkling water. I slowly turned a page and looked up at him without changing my relaxed expression. He marched right up to the glass coffee table and began screaming at the top of his lungs. He demanded to know what the hell I had done to his black card. He yelled that he had never been so thoroughly humiliated in his entire professional life and that he looked like an absolute beggar in front of his most important corporate clients. He commanded me to call the bank and reactivate his account immediately before he threw me out onto the street. I calmly placed a velvet bookmark into my magazine and set it down. I stood up, smoothed out my slacks, and walked over to the kitchen island, where the paper from this morning was still sitting. I picked up the strict 50-50 roommate agreement that he had so proudly drafted and signed just a few hours prior. I brought it back into the living room and held it up right in front of his flushed, angry face. I kept my voice incredibly soft and remarkably steady. I reminded him that we had a legally binding agreement to keep our finances completely separate starting today. I explained that since the black card was tied directly to my corporate portfolio and paid entirely by my private funds, it fell under my side of the financial divide. I told him he specifically ordered me to stop living off his money, so I simply stopped letting him live off mine. It was the exact financial independence he aggressively demanded at the restaurant last night. I asked him why he was so incredibly upset when I was merely following his brilliant new household rules. Bradley violently swatted the paper out of my hand, screaming that I was an insane, manipulative psychopath. He loudly claimed the money in those accounts belonged to him because he was the man of the house and the primary breadwinner. Before he could launch into another delusional rant, his cell phone started ringing frantically in his pocket. He pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was his mother, Brenda. Still breathing heavily, he answered the call and immediately put it on speakerphone, desperately trying to find an ally to validate his blind rage. Brenda's shrill voice instantly filled the room. She was not calling to check on her darling son. She was absolutely hysterical. She shrieked that she was standing at the front desk of the most expensive day spa in the city, and her payment for a $300 facial had just been declined. She yelled that the spa manager threatened to call local security because she had already received the luxury treatments and could not cover the final bill. She demanded to know why the monthly allowance check she received from us had bounced due to insufficient funds. Bradley looked completely paralyzed. He stared down at his phone and then slowly looked up at me, his eyes wide with a sudden terrifying realization. He finally understood the math. He realized that he had never actually paid his mother's allowance out of his own corporate salary. He had been taking all the immense credit and soaking up her praise while my trust account silently footed the bill every single month. I leaned forward so my voice would carry clearly into the phone microphone. I cheerfully greeted Brenda and apologized for her highly embarrassing spa situation. I told her that since Bradley had officially implemented a strict 50-50 financial split in our marriage, I was no longer contributing to his personal expenses or his family obligations. I suggested she ask her highly successful corporate son to transfer the funds from his own bank account right now, since he made all the real money in our family. Brenda let out a dramatic gasp on the other end of the line, calling me a selfish gold-digging monster before violently hanging up the phone. The dead silence that followed in the living room was completely deafening. Bradley just stood there staring at his dark phone screen. The harsh reality of his situation was finally crashing down on his heavy shoulders. He had zero access to my credit lines, his own bank account was practically empty, and his mother was expecting him to magically bail her out. He was completely trapped in the precise financial cage he had built to punish me. Bradley stood paralyzed in the living room for a full minute, trying to process the sheer gravity of his financial collapse. Instead of apologizing or asking for a mature conversation, his inflated ego took the wheel. He violently grabbed his car keys off the kitchen counter, muttered a string of nasty curses under his breath, and stormed right back out the front door. He sped away in his leased sports car, unaware that the vehicle was only weeks away from being repossessed now that I had stopped the ghost payments. The house fell completely silent again. I sat back down on the sofa and calmly picked up my architectural magazine exactly where I had left off. About 2 hours later, my cell phone began vibrating endlessly on the glass coffee table. Notifications were pouring in back to back. I unlocked the screen and opened the Facebook app. Olivia and Brenda had joined forces to launch a highly coordinated digital smear campaign against me. Brenda had posted a massive dramatic paragraph claiming she was heartbroken over the sudden cruel treatment her deeply devoted son was receiving from his ungrateful wife. She publicly accused me of being a lazy freelancer who was financially abusing Bradley and holding his hard-earned money hostage in a pathetic attempt to control him. Olivia chimed in right below it, sharing the post to her own timeline with an equally venomous caption. She called me a manipulative gold digger who contributed absolutely nothing to the family while leeching off her brother's corporate success. She tagged dozens of extended family members, mutual friends, and even a few of Bradley's coworkers. The comments section was already filling up with sympathetic messages from clueless relatives who praised Bradley for being such a generous provider and urged him to immediately file for divorce to protect his valuable assets. Any normal person would have felt a desperate urge to jump into the comments section and defend themselves. I could have easily uploaded a picture of the 50-50 roommate contract he forced me to sign. I could have exposed the fact that Brenda was crying over a declined facial at a luxury spa, not struggling to buy groceries, but I did not type a single word. Arguing with narcissists on social media is a completely pointless endeavor. Instead, I poured myself another glass of sparkling water and let them continue digging their own public graves. The louder they screamed about his vast imaginary wealth, the more humiliating it would be when the cold, hard reality finally crashed down on their heads. I swiped away from the Facebook app and opened the web browser on my phone. Since Bradley had publicly declared himself the sole financial provider and explicitly demanded we split the household expenses down the middle, it was time to finalize the utility situation. According to the spreadsheet he handed me that morning, he expected me to continue managing the accounts while he supposedly transferred his half. But I was officially out of the household management business. I logged directly into the city water and power portal. The current billing cycle was set to end in exactly 48 hours. With a few simple taps on the screen, I completely deleted my routing number from the primary payment method profile. I canceled the overarching autopay setup that had silently kept the lights on and the water running for the past 5 years. A bright red warning banner popped up on the screen, indicating that the account was now past due and failure to provide an immediate alternative payment method would result in a total service disconnection. I smiled softly and closed the browser. If Bradley was the powerful corporate breadwinner he claimed to be online, he would easily figure out how to pay a basic electric bill. But I knew the truth. He had never once looked at a utility bill in his entire life. He had no idea what company provided our power, what the account number was, or what day of the month the payments were even due. He lived in a state of deliberate financial ignorance, assuming the house just magically ran itself. I stood up from the sofa feeling lighter than I had in years. I walked upstairs to my master bedroom and began packing a sleek overnight bag. The tension in the house was about to reach a boiling point, and I had absolutely no intention of sticking around to watch him throw another childish temper tantrum. I was going to let his beloved 50-50 contract do all the heavy lifting while he desperately tried to maintain his fake billionaire persona for his gullible online audience. Exactly 48 hours later, the harsh reality of Bradley's financial ignorance struck with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. It was a bitterly cold Tuesday evening in Chicago. The temperature outside had dropped well below freezing, and the wind was howling against the heavy glass windows of our $2 million home. I was sitting comfortably in the master suite, reading a book under the warm glow of a bedside lamp. Bradley was downstairs in his usual spot, sprawled out on the expensive Italian leather sofa, playing a loud video game on his massive flat-screen television. Suddenly, the house plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The loud booming sound of the video game cut off instantly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. The sudden loss of power triggered the smart home's emergency protocol, causing the security system panel in the hallway to emit a sharp, continuous beep. I calmly closed my book and listened. From the floor below, I heard Bradley let out a frustrated groan, followed by the sound of him stumbling blindly in the dark. He cursed loudly, kicking the heavy mahogany coffee table with his bare toe. He began yelling my name, demanding to know why I had turned off the circuit breaker. He was so completely detached from the reality of running a household that his first logical assumption was that I had manually flipped a switch in the basement just to annoy him. I did not bother answering his ridiculous accusation. Instead, I grabbed my fully packed overnight bag from the closet and turned on the flashlight feature on my cell phone. I walked out of the bedroom and stood at the top of the grand staircase, shining the beam of light directly down at his confused, angry face. I kept my voice perfectly even and calm. I told him I did not touch the circuit breaker. I informed him that the local power company had officially disconnected our service due to non-payment. I reminded him that I had explicitly told him he was now responsible for setting up his own autopay for his half of the utilities, just like he demanded in his strict 50-50 roommate contract. I asked him if he had simply forgotten to log into the portal and submit his share. Bradley stared up at the light, completely bewildered. He stuttered aggressively, claiming that was completely impossible. He yelled that he made over $200,000 a year and that his bank account was practically overflowing with cash. He pulled his cell phone out of his pocket, his face illuminated by the harsh blue glow of the screen. He angrily tapped the screen, opening his mobile banking app to prove me wrong and show off his supposed wealth. I watched closely as his confident expression rapidly melted into sheer, unadulterated panic. The bright blue light from his phone screen illuminated the terrifying truth reflecting in his wide, terrified eyes. His checking account balance was not overflowing. It was sitting at a pathetic negative $42. The massive luxury car lease payment for his precious sports car had automatically processed that morning, draining every single cent of his recent paycheck. Without the secret influx of cash from my corporate trust to artificially inflate his balance, he had zero liquid cash left to his name. He frantically tapped the screen, opening his credit card portfolio, desperately hoping to find an available credit line. But I knew exactly what he was going to see. Every single card he owned was completely maxed out, because I was no longer quietly clearing the balances behind his back. He was standing in a freezing cold, pitch-black house worth millions of dollars, and he could not even afford to buy a cheap candle at a gas station. The mighty corporate breadwinner was completely broke. The temperature inside the house was dropping rapidly as the heavy winter chill seeped through the walls. Bradley began hyperventilating, his breath visible in the freezing air. He looked up at me, his voice trembling slightly, as he asked how we were supposed to get the heat turned back on tonight. He still used the word "we," hoping I would step in and fix the massive mess he had created. He wanted me to be the responsible adult and bail him out like I always did. I slowly walked down the staircase, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the freezing darkness. I stopped 2 steps above him, looking down at the man who had publicly humiliated me just days prior. I told him there was no we anymore. I reminded him that we were now independent financial entities, living under a strict legal agreement that he drafted. I suggested he call his mother or his sister to borrow some money since they were so incredibly proud of his massive corporate success online. He stood there shivering in the dark, completely helpless as the reality of his own arrogance finally froze him to the bone. I continued my descent down the grand staircase, the wheels of my designer suitcase gliding behind me. The sound echoed loudly in the silent, freezing hallway. Bradley finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He stumbled forward, his hands outstretched in the dark, demanding to know where I was going. He pointed out that the house was dropping in temperature and asked how I could leave him alone. I adjusted my heavy wool coat and told him I had prior engagements requiring my immediate attention. His stomach let out a loud, hollow rumble audible in the quiet living room. He shivered, wrapping his arms tightly around his chest. He ignored my suitcase and focused entirely on his physical discomfort. He demanded to know what was for dinner. He commanded me to make him something to eat because he had experienced the most humiliating week of his professional life and needed a hot meal. I aimed the bright beam of my cell phone flashlight toward the kitchen entrance. I told him he was welcome to raid the refrigerator. I reminded him that under his 50-50 roommate contract, we were no longer sharing groceries. I stated that he needed to rely entirely on the items he had personally purchased with his own hard-earned money. Bradley scoffed, claiming he had plenty of food. He marched past me and pushed through the swinging doors into the pitch-black kitchen. I followed closely behind, keeping the flashlight pointed at his back. He confidently grabbed the heavy stainless steel handle of the double-door refrigerator and yanked it open. Because the power was out, the interior lights did not illuminate. I aimed my flashlight onto the glass shelves to assist his search. Bradley gasped loudly in pure shock. The spacious luxury refrigerator was completely barren. The organic premium steaks, the imported European cheeses, the fresh produce, and the expensive meal prep containers were all gone. The only items left sitting on the illuminated glass shelves were the pathetic remnants of his personal shopping trip from weeks ago. Half a bottle of stale yellow mustard, a 6-pack of cheap domestic beer, and a single shriveled lemon sitting sadly in the crisper drawer. He frantically opened the freezer compartment, but it was just as empty. I had packed up all the frozen seafood and artisanal ice creams, leaving him with nothing but an empty ice bin. He slammed the refrigerator doors shut with tremendous force, the sound ringing sharply through the dark room. He turned to me, his face twisted in a mixture of extreme hunger and burning anger. He yelled that I was a petty, vindictive monster. He asked what he was supposed to eat for the next 3 days while the power company processed his payment. I smiled warmly, my face illuminated by the harsh glow of the flashlight. I told him he could eat exactly what his negative bank account allowed him to eat. I reminded him that I had packed my designer suitcase because I was attending an exclusive 3-day charity gala hosted at a luxury hotel downtown. I casually mentioned that my ticket included a fully catered steak dinner, an open bar, and a heated suite with a king-sized bed. I told him I planned to enjoy every second of it while he sat in the dark. He stepped forward, his voice dropping its arrogant tone and taking on a pathetic, desperate edge. He begged me to order him a simple pizza before I left. He promised he would pay me back the $20 as soon as his corporate paycheck cleared. He admitted he had no way to charge his dying cell phone and no cash to hand a delivery driver. The great provider was suddenly reduced to begging his freelance wife for a cheap cheese pizza. I looked him dead in the eyes and firmly shook my head. I told him I was not his personal emergency fund. I reminded him that he was the one who publicly demanded I stop living off his money. I told him it was time he learned how to survive on his own. I turned around and walked out of the kitchen, leaving him standing alone in the freezing darkness. I pulled my suitcase out the front door and locked it behind me. The bitterly cold winter wind whipped across my face, but I felt incredibly warm inside. I walked down the driveway and climbed into my sedan. I started the engine, blasting hot air through the vents. As I backed out of the driveway, I glanced up at the house. I barely made out Bradley's silhouette, standing by the living room window, staring out into the cold night. The king was finally locked inside his own empty, freezing castle. I spent the next 3 days at the charity gala living in absolute luxury. I drank champagne, networked with top corporate executives, and slept in a plush king-sized bed while the winter storm raged outside. I completely ignored the dozen missed calls and frantic voicemails he left on my phone. When I finally returned home on Sunday evening, the power had been miraculously restored. Bradley was nowhere to be found, but the kitchen trash can was overflowing with instant noodle cups and fast food wrappers. 2 days later, a sharp, heavy knock on the front door interrupted my morning coffee. I opened it to find a stoic process server standing on my porch. He handed me a thick manila envelope and quickly walked away without saying a word. I opened the heavy packet and pulled out a formal petition for dissolution of marriage. Bradley had officially filed for divorce. I read through the ridiculous legal documents and actually laughed out loud in my foyer. He was not filing for divorce because he truly wanted to leave me. He was using the legal system as a weapon to scare me into absolute submission. According to the attached demands, Bradley wanted to invoke our 50-50 roommate agreement on a permanent legal scale. He firmly believed the house was his primary asset. His aggressive strategy was transparent. He wanted to force the immediate sale of our $2 million home, expecting to walk away with half of the equity to cover his mounting personal debts. He assumed I was a terrified broke freelancer who would drop to her knees and beg him to stop the proceedings, because I could never afford to buy out his half. He thought the mere threat of losing my home would force me to turn his credit cards back on. I forwarded the documents to my corporate legal team. I instructed my lead attorney, a sharp woman named Diane, to schedule the first mediation meeting as soon as possible. I told her I wanted to give Bradley exactly what he was asking for. The very next afternoon, I walked into the sleek, high-rise conference room of Bradley's expensive divorce lawyer. Bradley was already sitting at the long mahogany table wearing one of his custom-tailored suits, looking incredibly smug and confident. He genuinely thought he had already won the war before the first battle even began. His attorney, an arrogant man with slicked-back hair and an expensive gold watch, cleared his throat and opened a thick leather binder. He looked across the table at me with a deeply condescending smirk. He formally announced that his client was willing to be highly generous, given my lack of steady income. He stated that Bradley would allow me to keep my small interior design business and my personal vehicle. In exchange, Bradley demanded exactly 50% of the home's current market value and an immediate equitable distribution of all shared household assets. Bradley leaned back in his plush leather chair, steepling his fingers together. He looked at me with a fake, sympathetic expression designed to make him look reasonable. He told me he did not want to leave me destitute, but he had to protect his hard-earned financial portfolio. He promised that if I just signed the preliminary agreement to sell the house today, he would graciously allow me to stay in the small guest bedroom until I found a cheap apartment. He was completely enjoying his powerful performance playing the merciful king, offering a few pathetic breadcrumbs to a starving peasant. Diane sat perfectly still next to me, her hands neatly folded on the polished wooden table. She did not interrupt their delusional monologue. She simply waited for them to finish laying out their ridiculous, arrogant demands. I looked Bradley directly in the eyes, keeping my expression completely unreadable. I knew that if I revealed the massive truth about the house, right now the game would end entirely too quickly. I needed him to dig his grave significantly deeper. I needed his awful family to become entirely complicit in his spectacular financial downfall. I looked down at my hands and took a deep, trembling breath, intentionally playing the part of the defeated, heartbroken wife. I softened my voice, making it sound incredibly fragile and scared. I quietly asked his lawyer if there was any possible way I could keep the house. I begged them to give me a little more time to come up with the money to buy out Bradley's half of the equity. Bradley's eyes instantly lit up with cruel, triumphant joy. He thought he had successfully broken my spirit. He had no idea I was just handing him the shovel to bury himself alive. His lawyer let out a short, patronizing chuckle. He leaned across the table, telling me they had no intention of waiting around for a freelance decorator to magically scrape together $1 million. He said Bradley had immediate financial obligations, and the asset needed to be liquidated to satisfy his rightful share. Bradley held up a hand, silencing his attorney. He wanted to be the one holding the axe. He looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile and said he understood this was incredibly hard for me. He told me he knew how much I loved the custom drapes and the expensive imported tile I picked out for the master bathroom. He had the audacity to say he was sorry my little design business was not successful enough to maintain the lifestyle he had generously provided. He said he was willing to give me exactly 30 days to secure a massive bank loan to buy him out. If I failed, the house would be listed on the open market immediately, and I would be legally required to vacate the premises. I forced my lower lip to tremble slightly, squeezing my eyes shut tight enough to force a single tear to roll down my cheek. I pulled a tissue from my purse and dabbed at my face, playing the role of the utterly devastated and terrified housewife perfectly. I looked up at him, my voice shaking. I told him I did not want to lose my beautiful home. I begged him to remember all the wonderful memories we built inside those walls over the last 5 years. I pleaded with him to reconsider the strict 50-50 split, claiming it was incredibly unfair to throw me out onto the cold street just because his corporate paycheck was bigger than my freelance income. Bradley was practically glowing from the inside out. My fake tears were absolute premium fuel for his massive narcissistic ego. He sat up taller, aggressively adjusting his expensive silk tie. He looked at my attorney Diane, asking her if she was going to explain the harsh realities of divorce law to her emotional client. He stated that fairness had absolutely nothing to do with adult business. He said he paid the massive mortgage with his hard-earned salary while I sat around matching fabric swatches all day. He declared that he owned 50% of the equity by basic legal right, and he was not going to walk away empty-handed just because I was feeling a little sentimental. Diane played her part flawlessly. She let out a heavy dramatic sigh and gently placed a reassuring hand on my arm. She looked at me with feigned pity and softly told me that Bradley had a remarkably strong and aggressive case. She advised me that fighting a forced sale would be incredibly expensive, and I did not have the financial resources to drag this out. She suggested I accept his 30-day buyout window to avoid a prolonged legal bloodbath that would leave me entirely bankrupt. Bradley smirked, entirely convinced he had just overpowered a top-tier attorney with his sheer masculine dominance. He told his lawyer to draw up the preliminary agreement immediately. He demanded a document stating that if I could not produce a cashier's check for $1 million in 30 days, I surrendered all rights to dispute the sale. I let out a soft, pathetic sob and nodded my head in utter defeat. I asked him if I could at least have the upcoming weekend to move my personal belongings into the small guest bedroom like he had offered earlier. I told him I needed time to slowly process the terrifying reality of my impending poverty. Bradley magnanimously agreed, stating he was not a completely heartless monster. He said I could stay in the tiny guest room as long as I kept out of his way and did not touch his expensive groceries. His lawyer slid the freshly printed preliminary agreement across the polished mahogany table. My hands shook deliberately as I picked up the heavy gold pen. I signed my name on the dotted line, officially agreeing to his ridiculous 30-day ultimatum. Bradley snatched the paper back the exact moment my pen lifted from the page. He stared at the fresh signature like he had just won the state lottery. The mediation meeting adjourned. Bradley stood up quickly, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out of the conference room without looking back. He strutted down the hallway like a victorious gladiator who had just conquered an entire empire. I remained seated in my leather chair, dabbing my eyes with the tissue until the heavy glass door clicked securely shut behind him. The moment he was entirely out of sight, my tears vanished completely. I dropped the crumpled tissue onto the table. Diane closed her legal pad and looked at me with a razor-sharp grin. She asked me if I thought he was actually going to survive the absolute financial bloodbath we were preparing for him. I smoothed out my tailored skirt and calmly told her he was not even going to survive the weekend. I walked out of Diane's office feeling a thrilling sense of anticipation. It was Friday morning and the weekend was officially here. I decided to spend the majority of the day at my actual corporate headquarters, finalizing a massive supply chain contract for N Vanguard. I needed to ensure my business empire was running flawlessly, while my personal life descended into calculated chaos. By the time I finished reviewing the quarterly financial reports and approving the new payroll budget, it was late in the afternoon. I drove back to the suburban neighborhood, feeling completely relaxed and entirely prepared for whatever pathetic tantrum Bradley was planning to throw next. As I turned my car onto our quiet, tree-lined street, I immediately noticed a strange white utility van speeding away from my driveway. The bright blue logo painted on the side of the vehicle proudly advertised a local 24-hour locksmith service. I narrowed my eyes, putting the car in park and grabbing my leather handbag. I walked gracefully up the stone pathway leading to the grand entryway. I pulled my house key from my purse and slid it directly into the heavy brass deadbolt. It did not turn. I jiggled the metal forcefully, but it was completely useless. The entire locking mechanism had been freshly replaced with a brand new silver cylinder. I took a slow step back and peered through the large, decorative glass panel situated right next to the front door. The scene unfolding inside my home was absolutely infuriating, but entirely predictable. Brenda and Olivia were standing right in the middle of my pristine living room. They were completely surrounded by dozens of heavily taped cardboard boxes and cheap plastic storage bins. They were aggressively moving Brenda into my house. Olivia was holding one of my rare imported ceramic vases, carelessly tossing it into a thick black plastic garbage bag like it was worthless trash. I raised my hand and pressed my finger firmly against the illuminated doorbell. I held it there relentlessly until the sharp chime echoed loudly and continuously through the entire first floor. Olivia dropped the black garbage bag and marched aggressively toward the entryway. She swung the heavy wooden door open, leaving the metal security chain attached so I could not step inside. She pulled a shiny new brass key from her designer pocket and dangled it right in front of my face with a sickeningly triumphant smirk. She loudly announced that Bradley had called them the second he left the lawyer's office to share the glorious news. She confidently stated that since I had officially signed the preliminary legal agreement regarding the house, they decided there was absolutely no reason for me to stick around for the next 30 days. She claimed her mother desperately needed a new place to stay because her luxury apartment lease was expiring and she could no longer afford the rent without Bradley's monthly allowance. Olivia declared that since the house supposedly belonged to her brother, they were simply securing his valuable financial asset against a desperate and completely broke gold digger. Brenda walked up right behind her daughter, holding a crystal glass filled with my most expensive vintage red wine. She looked me up and down with utter contempt and blatant disgust. She took a slow, arrogant sip from the glass and told me to go find a cheap motel on the bad side of town. She proudly proclaimed that she was the new lady of the house, and she refused to share her son's hard-earned property with a lazy freelancer. She bragged that Bradley gave them his full express permission to hire a professional locksmith and permanently change the locks while I was out pretending to work. Any normal homeowner would have instantly lost their mind. They would have screamed violently, banged their fists against the heavy doorframe, and immediately dialed emergency services to report an illegal home invasion. But I was not a normal homeowner, and I was playing a much larger game. I just stood there staring calmly at the two incredibly foolish women who had tormented me for 5 long years. They felt so undeniably powerful standing inside a multi-million-dollar estate they did not own a single square inch of. I kept my voice perfectly level and quietly asked them exactly what they had done with my personal belongings. Olivia laughed, a high-pitched mocking sound that grated against my ears. She pointed a manicured finger toward the side of the house. She told me they had packed up all my cheap clothes and worthless design junk and thrown it straight into the dusty garage where it belonged. She told me to grab my trash and get off her brother's property before she called the police on me for trespassing. Without waiting for my response, she slammed the heavy wooden door violently right in my face, and the new deadbolt clicked loudly into place. I stood on the porch for a moment, listening to the heavy deadbolt click into place. I did not bang on the wood or scream through the glass. Instead, I calmly turned around and walked down the stone pathway toward the side of the house. Olivia had mentioned throwing my belongings into the garage, and I needed to assess exactly how much evidence of their criminal behavior I was dealing with today. As I rounded the corner of the brick exterior, I saw the side door to the garage, propped wide open. I stopped at the edge of the driveway, staying entirely out of sight, just as a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. Jamal stepped out of his vehicle, looking exhausted from a long day at his accounting firm. He carried his heavy leather briefcase and loosened his tie, walking toward the open garage door, expecting to find his wife. I stayed perfectly still behind a large oak tree, watching the scene unfold. Jamal stepped inside the dimly lit garage and immediately froze. Olivia was aggressively kicking a box of my winter coats across the concrete floor. Brenda was standing nearby, ripping open a sealed container of my design portfolios and violently dumping the contents directly into a large industrial trash can. Jamal dropped his briefcase onto the floor. The heavy thud echoed loudly, causing both women to jump in surprise. He rushed forward and physically grabbed the black garbage bag right out of his wife's hands. He forcefully pulled it away from her, demanding to know what on earth they were doing. Olivia rolled her eyes and tried to snatch the bag back, but Jamal held his ground, his tall frame towering over her. He looked around at the absolute destruction of my personal property, his expression shifting from confusion to absolute horror. He asked Olivia if she had completely lost her mind. Olivia sneered, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. She proudly explained that Bradley had legally secured the house and they were just taking out the trash. Jamal practically yelled, cutting her off completely. He pointed a long finger at the brand new brass lock on the door leading into the main house. He informed her that what they were doing was not taking out the trash. He told them they were committing a felony. As a certified financial auditor who understood complex property laws, Jamal knew exactly how illegal this was. He explained that changing the locks on a legal resident without a formal court-ordered eviction notice was a massive crime punishable by severe fines and jail time. He added that maliciously destroying my personal property elevated the entire situation to a criminal offense. Brenda scoffed loudly from the corner of the garage, tossing another one of my expensive sketchbooks into the trash can. She waved her manicured hand dismissively at Jamal, telling him to stop being so incredibly dramatic. She claimed the house belonged to her son, and they had every right to protect his valuable assets from a desperate freeloader. Jamal turned to his mother-in-law, his voice vibrating with barely contained anger. He told Brenda that Bradley did not own the house. He fiercely reminded them about the tax documents addressed to N Vanguard LLC that he had specifically warned them about just days ago. He begged them to stop before they ruined their entire lives over a petty family grudge. Olivia stepped right into Jamal's personal space, her face twisted in an ugly mask of pure entitlement. She poked him hard in the chest and told him he was acting like a pathetic, spineless coward. She shrieked that Bradley was a real man who knew how to take absolute control of his household, while Jamal was too weak to even support his own wife. She commanded him to either help them move the rest of my heavy boxes or get back in his car and leave them alone. The utter disrespect in her voice was absolutely sickening. Jamal stared down at the woman he had married, his jaw clenched incredibly tight. The look of profound disappointment and absolute disgust in his eyes was unmistakable. He slowly shook his head, stepping backward away from the chaotic mess. He firmly told Olivia that he was officially done. He stated he would not be an accomplice to a criminal home invasion, and he absolutely refused to go down with their sinking ship. He picked up his leather briefcase from the concrete floor, turned his back on them, and walked straight out of the garage. As Jamal marched quickly down the driveway toward his SUV, his eyes locked directly onto mine. I stepped out from behind the large oak tree, offering him a brief, solemn nod of profound respect. He paused for a fraction of a second, shaking his head sympathetically, before climbing into his car and speeding away from the curb. He had tried his absolute best to save them from themselves, but they were entirely committed to their own spectacular destruction. Now that Jamal was gone, they had zero voices of reason left to hold them back. I pulled my cell phone from my handbag, entirely ready to execute the next phase of my master plan. I walked back to my sedan parked discreetly down the street, completely hidden by the heavy shadows of the large oak trees. I unlocked the doors, slid into the driver's seat, and turned on the engine to let the heater warm the cold interior. I did not drive away immediately. Instead, I reached into the back seat and grabbed my slim silver laptop resting inside my leather briefcase. I placed the computer on my lap and connected it to my secure mobile hotspot. The glowing screen illuminated the dark interior of my car, casting a pale light across my face as I prepared to strike the fatal legal blow. I opened my web browser and navigated directly to the Vanguard Commercial Property Management portal. This was the highly secure administrative side of my business empire. I typed in my complex administrative passwords and bypassed the two-factor authentication protocols. The dashboard loaded instantly, displaying a vast portfolio of luxury residential and commercial properties I secretly owned and operated across the state. I scrolled past the multi-million-dollar corporate warehouses and clicked specifically on the residential subdivision file containing my own home address. This was the single property that kept his fragile ego inflated. I opened the primary legal file attached to the property and smiled as the original occupancy contract populated the screen. Bradley had spent the last 5 years loudly bragging to anyone who would listen that he was paying the heavy mortgage on our beautiful $2 million home. He truly believed his monthly automated transfers were building his massive personal equity. But the truth was hidden right there in the bold black and white text of the document he blindly signed 5 years ago. It was not a mortgage agreement. It was a standard luxury residential lease contract. He was nothing more than a high-paying tenant, completely subject to the strict rules of my corporate entity. I navigated to the tenant violation section of the portal. The actions Brenda and Olivia had just gleefully performed inside the garage handed me the exact legal ammunition I needed to bypass the standard 30-day eviction procedures. According to Clause 4 of the lease agreement, any tenant who altered the physical security of the property, including unauthorized lock replacements, immediately forfeited their right of occupancy. Furthermore, Clause 7 explicitly prohibited subletting or moving in permanent residence without the prior written consent of the property management company. By moving Brenda into the master suite and changing the heavy brass deadbolt on the front door, Bradley had officially committed 2 severe breaches of contract in a single afternoon. He had given me the golden key to destroy him legally and completely. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I initiated the formal legal eviction protocol. I drafted a harsh, uncompromising 3-day notice to quit the premises. I listed the specific lease violations detailing the illegal lock change and the unauthorized resident. I attached a formal warning that failure to vacate the property immediately would result in severe legal action, including police intervention and criminal charges for trespassing. I also included a massive financial penalty clause for the malicious destruction of the personal property they had violently thrown into the garage. I made sure the language was utterly ruthless, leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation or emotional manipulation. The document carried the full, terrifying weight of a massive corporate legal team. I clicked the final approval button, generating an official digital document complete with the Vanguard corporate seal. I securely attached the file to a high-priority email and sent it directly to Bradley's corporate work address. I knew for a fact he never checked his work emails over the weekend. The eviction notice would sit silently in his corporate inbox, ticking down like a hidden time bomb while he spent the next 2 days celebrating his imaginary victory. He would be completely blind to the impending disaster until it was entirely too late to salvage the situation. But an email was not nearly enough for a man with an ego as massive as Bradley's. I needed a much more spectacular public delivery method. I opened a secondary secure communication channel and drafted a direct message to my lead attorney, Diane. I instructed her to coordinate directly with the local county sheriff's office on Monday morning. I wanted uniformed officers to physically serve the formal eviction paperwork right to the front door. I wanted the neighbors to watch. I wanted his mother to see the flashing police lights illuminating her stolen living room. I wanted them to feel the profound terror of realizing they had absolutely no legal rights to the ground they were standing on. I closed my laptop and slid it safely back into my leather briefcase. The trap was now fully operational and completely inescapable. I looked out the windshield, staring at the glowing windows of my home one last time. Inside those walls, two incredibly foolish women were drinking my expensive wine and celebrating a victory they had not actually won. They thought they had successfully thrown me out onto the cold streets. They had no idea I was the landlord, and they had just officially evicted themselves. I put my car into drive, pulled away from the curb, and headed downtown to enjoy the rest of my peaceful weekend. The weekend passed in a state of absolute, blissful quiet. I stayed in a luxury hotel suite, ordered expensive room service, and completely ignored the dozen or so angry text messages Bradley sent demanding to know where I was hiding. When Monday morning finally rolled around, I arrived at my sleek glass-walled executive office at the Vanguard headquarters. I poured myself a fresh cup of espresso and opened my laptop, eager to watch the brilliant chaos I had carefully orchestrated finally unfold. Across town, Bradley marched into his own corporate office building feeling like an absolute conqueror. He was the director of sales at a mid-sized architectural development firm, and his ego was severely inflated by his perceived weekend victory. He sat down at his desk and opened his work computer. If he had simply checked his incoming legal communications folder, he would have seen the formal eviction notice sitting right there, warning him of his impending doom. But Bradley was far too arrogant to check for incoming threats. He was completely focused on going on the offensive. Taking the house was simply not enough for him. He wanted to completely break me. He wanted to ensure my tiny freelance interior design business was entirely ruined, so I would have absolutely no choice but to crawl back to him, begging for basic survival money. He opened a new email draft and began typing out a highly vindictive and wildly unethical memo. Using his official corporate letterhead and his powerful job title, Bradley addressed the email to the top-tier wholesale material suppliers and high-end furniture distributors his development firm partnered with. He explicitly named me and warned them that I was a massive financial liability. He instructed every single vendor to immediately blacklist my personal name and deny me any professional trade discounts or lines of credit. He claimed I was a fraud who could not pay my bills, and strongly implied that doing business with me would jeopardize their lucrative contracts with his firm. He confidently hit the send button, entirely convinced he had just masterfully destroyed my professional reputation in the design industry with a single click. He leaned back in his leather desk chair, completely oblivious to the massive corporate landmine he had just violently stomped on. What Bradley never bothered to realize during our entire 5-year marriage was that the wholesale suppliers he just emailed did not operate independently. They were actually subsidiary branches operating entirely under the massive financial umbrella of Vanguard, LLC. My company was the primary supply chain titan that provided the raw materials his development firm desperately needed to survive. He had just sent a malicious, threatening email demanding the sabotage of the chief executive officer of his own parent supplier. Less than 10 minutes after Bradley sent his ridiculous blacklist demand, my office phone rang. It was David, my incredibly sharp chief financial officer. He walked into my office holding a printed copy of Bradley's email. He placed it on my glass desk with a look of absolute disbelief. David explained that the account managers at our subsidiary branches were highly confused and deeply alarmed when they received a hostile directive targeting their ultimate boss. I picked up the paper and read Bradley's desperate attempt to ruin my life. I could not help but laugh out loud at the sheer, unadulterated stupidity of his actions. By using his official corporate email to execute a petty personal vendetta, he had committed a massive breach of corporate ethics. He also inadvertently threatened to illegally leverage his firm's buying power, which violated several federal antitrust regulations. I looked up at David and gave him a razor-sharp smile. I instructed him to forward Bradley's email directly to the chief executive officer of Bradley's development firm. I told David to attach a formal corporate grievance from N Vanguard LLC. We were going to officially notify them that their arrogant director of sales was fostering a hostile, unethical business environment. I demanded David include a strict ultimatum stating that N Vanguard was prepared to immediately sever our multi-million-dollar supply contract and completely freeze their material shipments if this aggressive behavior was not rectified within the hour. David nodded his head in full agreement, his eyes gleaming with professional, ruthless efficiency. He marched out of my office to make the call. Bradley was currently sitting in his office sipping his morning coffee and congratulating himself on his sheer brilliance. He had absolutely no idea that his vindictive little email had just triggered a catastrophic corporate earthquake. He thought he was squashing a tiny freelance decorator, but he had actually declared war on a massive corporate empire. And his own chief executive officer was about to come marching down the hallway to deliver the fatal blow. While the corporate guillotine was slowly descending on Bradley's career, my oblivious husband and his terrible family were entirely focused on a much more festive priority. It was the week of Thanksgiving. Instead of checking his email or preparing for the catastrophic fallout at his office, Bradley was busy playing the role of the wealthy lord of the manor. Brenda had officially moved all of her cheap plastic bins into my luxurious master suite and immediately took over the entire household. She was determined to host the largest and most extravagant Thanksgiving dinner our prestigious neighborhood had ever seen. She wanted to loudly announce to all of her wealthy socialite friends that her successful son had finally kicked his freeloading wife to the curb and reclaimed his massive estate. I spent my week working quietly from my executive office, making sure the legal eviction paperwork was perfectly aligned with the local sheriff's department schedule. I had intentionally requested that the formal service be delayed until Thursday afternoon. I wanted the absolute maximum number of witnesses present when the reality of their situation finally crashed down on them. I wanted their humiliation to be a public spectacle. On Tuesday afternoon, my receptionist walked into my office holding a thick, cream-colored envelope. She looked highly amused as she handed it to me. The envelope was sealed with cheap gold wax and addressed to my full legal name in overly dramatic calligraphy. I slid my silver letter opener through the heavy paper and pulled out an incredibly elaborate invitation card. It was a formal invitation to the first annual Thanksgiving Gala, hosted by Brenda and Bradley. They had the sheer audacity to list my own home address as the venue. At the very bottom of the elegant card, Brenda had scrawled a handwritten note in thick black ink. She wrote that since I was likely spending the holidays alone in a cheap motel, she and Bradley had graciously decided to extend an olive branch. She stated I was welcome to stop by the kitchen entrance between the hours of 4 and 5 to pick up a plastic container of leftover turkey. She explicitly warned me not to enter through the front door because they were hosting very important corporate guests and did not want my depressing presence to ruin the festive holiday aesthetic. The absolute arrogance radiating from that small piece of cardboard was genuinely astounding. They were standing directly on top of a massive trap door, and instead of looking down, they were loudly inviting 50 people to come watch them pull the lever. I set the ridiculous invitation on my glass desk and laughed until my sides physically ached. They genuinely believed they had completely broken me. They thought I was a pathetic, helpless woman hiding in the shadows mourning the loss of a fake marriage in a stolen house. I opened my personal email and typed out a remarkably polite response. I sent it directly to Bradley's phone, ensuring he would see it immediately. I thanked them for their generous invitation and formally accepted. I noted that I would be arriving promptly at 4:00, but I would definitely not be using the kitchen entrance. I also mentioned I was bringing a few very special plus ones to the dinner party. I knew Bradley would read that message and assume I was bringing a cheap lawyer or a sympathetic friend to beg for my house back in front of his wealthy guests. His massive ego would not allow him to imagine any other scenario. I spent the entirety of Wednesday preparing my wardrobe for the main event. I wanted to look absolutely flawless. I visited my favorite luxury boutique and purchased a stunning tailored wool suit in a deep shade of crimson. It was the kind of outfit that commanded absolute authority and demanded total respect. I paired it with my most expensive diamond earrings and a pair of sleek black leather heels. I was not going to show up to my own property looking like a defeated victim. I was going to arrive looking exactly like the multi-million-dollar corporate chief executive officer that I actually was. When Thursday morning finally arrived, the crisp autumn air was thick with anticipation. The city was quiet as families gathered in their homes to celebrate the holiday. But inside my stolen $2 million estate, I knew Brenda and Olivia were frantically running around the kitchen screaming at the hired catering staff. I knew Bradley was strutting around the living room in a custom suit pouring expensive scotch for his early arriving guests. They were completely ready to celebrate their ultimate victory. They had absolutely no idea their perfect holiday was about to become the most spectacular legal massacre. At exactly 3:45 in the afternoon, I pulled my sedan onto my familiar tree-lined street. The entire neighborhood was completely packed with expensive luxury vehicles parked along the curbs. Bradley and Brenda had clearly invited every single wealthy socialite corporate executive and distant relative they could possibly find. I slowly drove past my own house, listening to the faint sounds of loud laughter and clinking crystal glasses drifting through the crisp autumn air. The smell of roasted turkey and expensive cigars hung heavily in the breeze. I did not park in my own driveway. Instead, I pulled over a few houses down right behind two large black and white county sheriff cruisers. I stepped out of my car, smoothing the wrinkles from my crimson wool suit. The cold wind bit at my face, but my adrenaline was pumping far too hard for me to feel the chill. Two uniformed deputies stepped out of their cruisers. The lead officer was a tall, broad-shouldered man named Deputy Miller. He had a stern, no-nonsense expression on his face and a heavy-duty utility belt strapped to his waist. Standing right next to him was my brilliant lead attorney, Diane, holding a thick leather briefcase containing the fully executed eviction documents. She gave me a sharp, knowing nod as I approached them. I thanked the deputies for their prompt arrival. Deputy Miller tipped his hat slightly and informed me that they were fully briefed on the situation. He patted the thick manila folder tucked firmly under his arm, confirming he had the official court-approved notice to vacate. Diane adjusted her glasses and told me the trap was primed and ready to spring. We turned in unison and began marching up the long paved driveway together. The rhythmic sound of our footsteps on the cold concrete felt like the ticking of a massive heavy clock finally striking midnight. Through the large front bay windows, I could easily see the massive Thanksgiving party in full swing. At least 50 people were crammed into my beautifully decorated living room. Brenda was holding court near the grand fireplace wearing a gaudy sequined dress and holding a glass of champagne. Olivia was laughing loudly with a group of female guests. And right by the front door, standing like a proud king welcoming his loyal subjects, was Bradley. I walked straight past the side pathway leading to the kitchen entrance, completely ignoring Brenda's pathetic handwritten instructions. I stepped right up to the grand front entrance with Diane on my left and the two armed deputies on my right. I reached out and firmly pressed the illuminated doorbell. Inside the house, I saw Bradley turn his head toward the door. He checked his expensive gold watch, probably assuming it was another high-level corporate executive arriving fashionably late. He handed his drink to a passing waiter and swung the heavy wooden door open, with a massive welcoming smile plastered across his face. The exact second his eyes registered my presence, his smile vanished completely. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. He looked at my expensive crimson suit and his jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might shatter. He immediately stepped forward, trying to block the entryway with his body. He lowered his voice into a harsh, aggressive whisper, demanding to know what I was doing at the front door. He commanded me to go around to the kitchen like a hired servant and get my pathetic leftovers before I embarrassed him in front of his important friends. He was so blinded by his own anger that he did not even process the people standing directly behind me. I simply smiled, maintaining perfect eye contact, and calmly told him I was just keeping my promise. I reminded him that I explicitly stated in my email I would be bringing a few very special plus ones to his little dinner party. I took a single step to the side, revealing the two fully uniformed county sheriff deputies standing proudly on my porch. Bradley's arrogant posture completely dissolved in a fraction of a second. His eyes went wide with sudden, terrifying confusion as he stared at the shiny silver badges pinned to their chests. The loud radio crackle from Deputy Miller's shoulder microphone cut through the tense silence. Bradley frantically held up his hands, attempting to play the role of the innocent, confused homeowner. He forced a nervous chuckle and asked the officers if there was some kind of mistake. He claimed they were just having a peaceful family Thanksgiving dinner and insisted they had the wrong house. Deputy Miller did not smile. He stepped right past me, standing directly face to face with Bradley. He placed his heavy hand on the manila folder and asked him to confirm his legal identity. Bradley stammered out his full name, his voice shaking slightly under the intense scrutiny of law enforcement. Deputy Miller looked him dead in the eyes and loudly announced that there was absolutely no mistake. He stated they were here to execute an immediate mandatory eviction on behalf of the property owner, and the entire house needed to be completely vacated within the next 60 minutes. The music inside the house suddenly seemed entirely too loud against the dead silence on the front porch. Bradley let out a sharp, nervous laugh, looking back and forth between Deputy Miller and Diane. He aggressively pointed his finger at his own chest and loudly declared that he was the property owner. He shouted that his name was on the marital documents and he had been paying the massive mortgage on this estate for the last 5 years. He told the officers they were committing a massive civil rights violation and threatened to have their badges revoked by morning. The commotion at the front door had finally caught the attention of the Thanksgiving guests. The loud, cheerful chatter in the living room began to rapidly die down. Brenda pushed her way through the crowd of wealthy socialites, her sequined dress catching the light. She marched right up behind Bradley, holding her crystal champagne flute. She demanded to know what these officers were doing interrupting her exclusive holiday party. She looked at me with absolute venom and accused me of filing a fake police report just to ruin their perfect family evening. Diane calmly opened her thick leather briefcase right there on the front porch. She pulled out a stack of legally certified documents bearing the official county seal. She held up the first page directly in front of Bradley's red and sweating face. She instructed him to read the name of the actual property owner listed on the official county deed. Bradley squinted at the paper, his eyes darting across the black text. He read the words, N. Vanguard, LLC, out loud, his voice dripping with absolute confusion. He arrogantly stated that N. Vanguard was just a corporate management shell used by his bank to handle his personal mortgage. I finally stepped forward, breaking my absolute silence. I looked at the crowd of 50 wealthy guests, who were now hanging on to every single word. I raised my voice just enough so it carried perfectly into the grand foyer. I told Bradley that N. Vanguard LLC was not a banking shell. I proudly announced that I was the sole owner and chief executive officer of that corporation. I watched the realization slowly begin to wash over the faces of the corporate executives standing in my living room. They recognized my massive company name immediately. Bradley shook his head wildly, his brain completely rejecting the horrific reality. He yelled that it was physically impossible because he transferred over $4,000 every single month directly to the property management portal. He screamed that he built the equity in this house with his own hard-earned corporate salary. I smiled a cold and completely ruthless smile. I looked him dead in his panicked eyes and delivered the first massive nuke of the evening. I told him he had never paid a single mortgage payment in his entire adult life. I carefully explained that the document he proudly signed 5 years ago was not a mortgage deed, but a standard luxury residential lease agreement. I told him that every single time he transferred money into that portal, he was simply paying his monthly rent to my corporate entity. I stated that he was nothing more than a high-paying tenant living inside my personal investment property. I made it absolutely and devastatingly clear. He owned 0% of the house. He had absolutely no equity, no legal rights, and no ownership whatsoever. His entire life was nothing but a rented illusion that I had carefully subsidized entirely behind his back. The crystal champagne flute slipped right out of Brenda's manicured hand. It hit the hardwood floor of the foyer, shattering into dozens of sharp pieces. The loud crash echoed through the dead-silent house. She stared at me, her mouth hanging wide open, unable to formulate a single coherent word. Olivia pushed her way to the front of the crowd, her face completely drained of color. The arrogant sneers they had worn all week had been entirely wiped away, replaced by absolute, unadulterated terror. Bradley grabbed the legal papers from Diane's hand, frantically flipping through the pages. He was desperately searching for his own name on a deed that simply did not exist. His chest heaved heavily as he struggled to breathe. He looked like a man who had just stepped out of an airplane, only to realize he forgot to strap on his parachute. Deputy Miller placed a firm hand heavily onto Bradley's shaking shoulder. He firmly stated that the lease violations were severe and the eviction was not up for debate. The countdown had officially started and they had less than an hour to pack their pathetic bags. Bradley aggressively snatched the documents back from Deputy Miller, refusing to accept the catastrophic reality staring him right in the face. He frantically pointed at the signature line, demanding the officer verify the authenticity of the paperwork. He shouted that anyone could print a fake deed off the internet and begged the police to arrest me for fraud. Deputy Miller was completely unbothered by his frantic outburst. He calmly took the heavy folder back, pulled out his secure county-issued tablet, and began typing in the property parcel numbers to cross-reference the official digital database. The silence in the grand living room was absolutely suffocating. 50 of the most influential people in our suburban community stood completely paralyzed, holding their expensive drinks, watching the glorious king of the castle unravel like a cheap sweater. Deputy Miller looked up from his glowing tablet and stared directly at Bradley. He raised his deep, authoritative voice, ensuring every single person in the massive room could hear him perfectly clear. He announced that the digital county records matched the physical documents flawlessly. He stated that N Vanguard, LLC, was the sole legal owner of the property, and Bradley was officially registered as a standard residential tenant. The officer did not stop there. He pulled out the formal eviction notice I had emailed to Bradley's corporate office days prior. Deputy Miller loudly informed the entire crowd that the tenant had severely violated multiple clauses of the strict lease agreement by illegally changing the heavy front door locks and moving unauthorized individuals into the primary residence. He confirmed that the mandatory 3-day notice to quit the premises had expired and Bradley was now legally classified as a hostile squatter on private property. The word squatter hung heavily in the warm air, completely destroying whatever tiny shred of dignity Bradley had left. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of wealthy socialites and high-level corporate executives. These were people Bradley had spent the last 5 years aggressively bragging to. He had constantly boasted about his massive mortgage, his incredible real estate equity, and his vast financial superiority. Now they were all standing in my beautiful living room, realizing the man they admired was nothing more than a pathetic fraud renting a lifestyle he could never actually afford. One of the senior partners from Bradley's development firm, a stern-looking man named Richard, slowly set his crystal glass down on the mahogany side table. He looked at Bradley with an expression of absolute, profound disgust. Bradley took a desperate step toward him, stammering out pathetic excuses, claiming this was just a bitter ex-wife playing a nasty legal trick. Richard shook his head, tightened his expensive silk tie, and silently walked toward the grand entryway. That single dismissive movement broke the dam. Suddenly, the entire room erupted into a chaotic flurry of hushed whispers and immediate movement. Guests began frantically abandoning their drinks and rushing toward the hallway closet to retrieve their heavy winter coats. Nobody wanted to be associated with a criminal eviction. Brenda completely panicked. She chased after her wealthy socialite friends, grabbing their arms and desperately trying to salvage her shattered reputation. She shrieked that it was all a massive misunderstanding and begged them to stay for the expensive catered turkey currently warming in the kitchen. But her friends physically pulled away from her grasp, looking at her like she was carrying a highly contagious disease. They hurried out the front door, keeping their heads down, eager to escape the humiliating circus. The smell of the expensive holiday meal now felt like a sick joke. Olivia tried to quietly slip past the deputies and head toward the grand staircase, but my attorney Diane immediately stepped directly into her path. Diane pointed a sharp, manicured finger at the terrified younger woman. Diane loudly advised Deputy Miller that the unauthorized occupants had also maliciously destroyed thousands of dollars worth of the landlord's personal property in the garage. She formally requested that the officers closely monitor the eviction process to ensure these squatters did not steal or damage any of the luxury appliances, custom fixtures, or expensive furniture belonging to N Vanguard LLC as they packed their bags. Deputy Miller nodded firmly and unclipped his heavy radio. He called for 2 additional patrol cars to assist in monitoring the forced removal of the hostile tenants. Bradley stood completely frozen in the center of the rapidly emptying living room. The grand holiday party he had funded with his last remaining pennies was officially dead. His corporate colleagues had abandoned him. His mother was sobbing hysterically on the hardwood floor, and his sister was being heavily guarded by an armed police officer. He slowly looked at me, his arrogant eyes finally filled with the cold, dark terror of absolute defeat. I simply stood by the open front door, holding my head high, completely, ready to watch the trash take itself out. Deputy Miller did not waste another second. He stepped fully into the grand foyer and loudly announced that the countdown had officially begun. He instructed the 2 newly arrived patrol officers to escort the unauthorized individuals upstairs to collect their immediate personal belongings. He made it crystal clear that they were only allowed to take clothing and basic toiletries. Anything else, including furniture, electronics, or home decor, was strictly off-limits and would be considered felony theft if removed from the property. Brenda let out a high-pitched wail, dropping to her knees on the expensive hardwood floor. She dramatically clutched her sequined dress, sobbing that she had nowhere to go, and that this was her son's house. The officers were entirely unmoved by her theatrical performance. One of the younger deputies firmly grasped her by the arm and pulled her to her feet, guiding her toward the grand staircase. Olivia tried to push past them, shouting that she needed to call her lawyer, but Diane calmly reminded her that no lawyer in the state could reverse a lawful eviction on a holiday evening. The next 45 minutes were a symphony of absolute chaotic panic. I stood in the hallway with Diane, watching the spectacular downfall unfold. Upstairs, I could hear drawers being slammed violently and heavy footsteps running back and forth across the hardwood. Brenda and Olivia were frantically stuffing their cheap clothes into large black garbage bags because they had moved all their actual luggage into the dusty garage days ago. At one point, Olivia attempted to carry my expensive imported silk bedding down the stairs, claiming she had purchased it herself. Diane immediately stepped forward, clipboard in hand, and coldly informed the deputy that the bedding was a documented asset of the corporate estate. The officer forcefully instructed Olivia to drop the blankets immediately. She threw the expensive fabric onto the stairs with a frustrated scream, her face red with extreme humiliation and burning anger. Bradley was the absolute worst of them all. He did not pack anything. He wandered out of the master suite completely dazed, looking like a ghost haunting his own ruined castle. He stood at the top of the stairs, staring down at me with hollow, empty eyes. He finally realized that every single thing in the house, the custom artwork, the expensive electronics, the premium furniture, belonged exclusively to me. He had spent all his money on leased luxury cars and expensive country club lunches. He literally owned nothing but the custom-tailored suit currently on his back. When the deadline finally expired, Deputy Miller clapped his heavy hands loudly together. He ordered them out of the house immediately. The grand procession was a pathetic sight to behold. Brenda dragged two bulging black trash bags across the pristine marble floor, her expensive mascara running in thick black lines down her face. Olivia followed closely behind, angrily muttering under her breath while carrying a cracked plastic laundry basket full of shoes. Bradley walked entirely empty-handed. His head hung so low his chin nearly touched his chest. The officers escorted them directly out the front door and marched them down the long stone pathway. The bitterly cold winter wind immediately hit their faces. They were forced to stand on the freezing concrete curb right next to the neighborhood street lamp. The remaining caterers who had watched the entire legal drama unfold quietly packed up their professional equipment and drove away, leaving the massive roasted turkey sitting cold and abandoned on the kitchen island. Bradley stopped at the edge of the driveway and turned around to face me one last time. His arrogant facade was completely destroyed. He took a hesitant step forward, his voice cracking as he begged me to stop this madness. He pleaded with me to let them back inside, just for the night, promising he would sign whatever legal documents I wanted in the morning. He told me it was freezing outside, and his mother was violently shivering in the cold winter air. I stood securely inside the warm doorway, flanked by my brilliant attorney and the county sheriff. I looked at the man who had publicly humiliated me, thrown his credit card in my face, and tried to legally steal my entire livelihood. I kept my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any sympathetic emotion. I told him he had demanded we live completely separate financial lives, and I was simply honoring his strict request. I advised him to call a cheap taxi and find a budget motel. Deputy Miller stepped forward, blocking Bradley's path, and ordered him to step back onto the public sidewalk. I reached out, grabbed the heavy brass handle, and pulled the thick wooden door firmly shut, locking the new deadbolt with a loud, satisfying click. I did not remain inside the house for very long. The grand living room reeked of cheap floral perfume and the stale aroma of abandoned catering food. I had absolutely no intention of spending my holiday evening cleaning up their pathetic mess. I turned to my attorney Diane and thanked her for her brilliant execution. I instructed the private security team we hired to remain stationed inside the foyer for the rest of the night, ensuring the former tenants did not attempt a desperate break-in. I grabbed my leather handbag, wrapped my heavy wool coat tightly around my shoulders, and exited through the side garage door to walk back to my parked sedan. The crisp winter air felt incredibly refreshing. As I walked across the frosted grass of the expansive front lawn, I saw them. Bradley, Brenda, and Olivia were still huddled together on the public sidewalk, shivering violently next to their pathetic pile of black garbage bags. The remaining party guests had long since driven away, leaving the street completely abandoned and dead silent. Bradley spotted me walking across the lawn and immediately broke away from his mother. He marched onto the edge of the grass, his face pale and his eyes completely bloodshot. He held up his hands, stopping a few feet away from me. He was no longer yelling or making arrogant demands. His voice was completely hollowed out by pure shock. He begged me to explain what was actually happening. He asked how a freelance interior decorator who barely made enough to cover weekly groceries could possibly own a massive corporate entity like Vanguard LLC. He desperately wanted to understand how he had been so completely blind for 5 entire years. I stopped walking and stood firmly on the cold grass, looking at the man who had treated me like a useless burden. I decided it was finally time to put him out of his intellectual misery. I kept my voice perfectly even and razor sharp. I told him I was never a simple freelance decorator. I explained that I used that fake title because I knew his fragile masculine ego could never handle being married to a woman who was vastly more successful than him. I told him I was the founder and active chief executive officer of Vanguard, a commercial supply chain empire, generating millions of dollars in annual profit. Bradley stared at me, his jaw slightly open. He shook his head slowly, muttering that Vanguard was the primary material supplier for his own architectural development firm. He stated that his entire corporate division relied exclusively on those specific supply chain contracts to survive. He was slowly connecting the massive invisible dots. I offered him a cold, merciless smile. I congratulated him on finally figuring out the basic structure of his own industry. I reminded him about the highly vindictive and wildly unethical email he had sent out on Monday morning. I recalled how he had proudly used his official corporate letterhead to contact all of his top-tier wholesale material suppliers, demanding they blacklist me and destroy my tiny freelance career. I asked him if he honestly thought those massive distribution warehouses operated independently. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. His breath hitched in his throat, forming small white clouds in the freezing air. He realized the fatal magnitude of his massive mistake. I stepped slightly closer to him, ensuring every single word pierced directly through his inflated ego. I told him that every single vendor he emailed was a subsidiary branch owned entirely by Vanguard LLC. I explained that when he aggressively demanded the sabotage of my personal career, he was actually ordering my own loyal employees to attack their chief executive officer. I watched his entire body tremble as the sheer, unadulterated stupidity of his actions fully materialized in his mind. He had not just stepped on a corporate landmine, he had actively swallowed a live grenade. Brenda and Olivia stood frozen on the sidewalk, clutching their cheap trash bags, straining to hear every single word of my devastating revelation. Brenda looked like she was going to physically collapse onto the freezing concrete. The brilliant, highly successful son she had shamelessly worshipped was completely imploding right in front of her eyes. I told Bradley my chief financial officer immediately forwarded his pathetic, threatening email directly to the chief executive officer of his development firm. We officially threatened to completely sever the multi-million-dollar supply contract that kept his firm afloat unless they immediately dealt with their rogue, arrogant director of sales. Bradley pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen illuminated his terrified face, showing dozens of missed calls and urgent voicemails from his corporate superiors. He had completely destroyed his own career to satisfy a petty personal vendetta, and I had simply stood back and let him pull the trigger. Right on cue, the glowing screen in Bradley's hand began vibrating violently. The caller identification boldly displayed the name of the chief executive officer of his architectural firm, Mr. Preston. Bradley stared at the ringing phone like it was a venomous snake preparing to strike. His thumb hovered over the glowing green button, trembling so hard he could barely press it. I took a slow step closer, crossing my arms tightly against the freezing winter wind. I told him he should probably answer that incoming call. I pointed out that it was incredibly unprofessional to keep his supreme boss waiting, especially on a major holiday when emergency corporate damage control was clearly required. Bradley slowly swiped his thumb across the cracked screen and brought the phone to his ear. He managed to choke out a weak greeting, but he did not even get the chance to finish his first sentence. Even standing several feet away, I could clearly hear the explosive screaming coming through the small receiver. Mr. Preston's voice was booming with absolute, undeniable fury, echoing sharply in the quiet suburban street. Bradley frantically pulled the phone away from his ear and accidentally hit the speaker button in his sheer panic. The furious voice of his chief executive officer instantly filled the freezing night air, ensuring his mother and sister heard every single humiliating syllable. Mr. Preston demanded to know what kind of absolute reckless idiot uses an official corporate email to launch a petty personal vendetta against a major supply chain titan. Bradley stammered desperately, trying to defend himself. He claimed he had absolutely no idea I owned the supply company, and frantically swore it was just a massive misunderstanding between a frustrated husband and his wife. He begged for a chance to explain the situation logically. Mr. Preston let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded exactly like grinding metal. He screamed that he did not care at all about Bradley's pathetic domestic disputes. He announced that Vanguard had just issued a formal notice of termination for their primary commercial material contract. He explained that without those specific raw materials, the entire development firm would literally grind to a complete halt within a single week. He shouted that Bradley's little email was about to cost the firm tens of millions of dollars in delayed construction penalties and breached contracts. Bradley begged for a single chance to fix it. He promised he could talk to me and smooth everything over right now. He pleaded with Mr. Preston to give him 24 hours to personally salvage the multi-million-dollar deal. I smiled a cold, ruthless smile and leaned closer to the phone. I spoke loudly and clearly, addressing the incredibly angry man on the other end of the line. I said, "Good evening. Mr. Preston, this is Nora Vanguard." I calmly assured him that my corporate legal team was perfectly willing to immediately rescind the contract termination notice and continue our lucrative business relationship under one very specific and entirely non-negotiable condition. The phone went completely dead silent for a brief second before Mr. Preston responded, his tone instantly shifting from blind, screaming rage to highly respectful corporate diplomacy. He addressed me directly as Ms. Vanguard and eagerly asked what his firm needed to do to maintain the vital contract. I looked directly into Bradley's terrified, bloodshot eyes as I delivered my final corporate demand. I told Mr. Preston that N Vanguard simply refused to do business with any firm that employed executives who actively engaged in malicious corporate sabotage and unethical harassment. I stated that as long as Bradley remained on their payroll, our supply chain doors were permanently closed. Mr. Preston did not even hesitate for a fraction of a second. He did not ask for time to consult his human resources department or review Bradley's employee performance file. The cold, hard mathematical choice was incredibly simple. He had to choose between a highly replaceable sales director and a massive multi-million-dollar supply pipeline. Mr. Preston's voice turned incredibly cold and entirely devoid of any human sympathy. He addressed Bradley directly over the speakerphone. He stated that due to gross misconduct, severe violations of corporate ethics, and active sabotage, Bradley was officially terminated effective immediately. He ordered Bradley not to step foot on company property ever again, warning him that building security would have him forcefully arrested for trespassing. He added that the corporate legal department would be mailing his final separation paperwork, and they were actively looking into filing a massive civil lawsuit against him for heavily jeopardizing the company infrastructure. The line went completely dead. A sharp, automated beep signaled the abrupt end of the call and the absolute destruction of Bradley's entire professional existence. The phone slipped right out of his trembling hand and crashed onto the frozen concrete sidewalk. He fell to his knees on the cold, frosted grass, burying his face in his empty hands. He was no longer the arrogant king of the castle or the wealthy corporate provider. He was just a broke, homeless, and permanently unemployed man crying on a public street corner. Brenda let out another dramatic, wailing sob, clutching her black garbage bags as if they were her last remaining possessions on earth. Olivia just stood there, completely silent, finally realizing the absolute magnitude of the beast they had carelessly awakened. They had spent 5 years treating me like a pathetic, useless burden, trying to crush me under their expensive designer shoes. But in their arrogant attempt to bury me, they simply forgot I was the one who owned the shovel. The sharp sound of heavy tires rolling over the freezing asphalt shattered the dead silence of the neighborhood. Bright white headlights suddenly swept across the frosted lawn, illuminating the pathetic scene unfolding on the public sidewalk. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb and shifted into park. It was Jamal. Olivia let out a loud, dramatic gasp of pure relief. She genuinely believed her husband had sensed her distress and rushed back to rescue her from the biting cold winter wind. She immediately ran toward the vehicle, crying loudly, expecting him to open the passenger door and whisk her away to the safety of their warm apartment. Jamal stepped out of the driver's side, wearing a heavy tailored winter coat. He did not open the passenger door for her. He did not rush forward to wrap his arms around his freezing wife. He simply stood by the hood of his vehicle, holding a crisp manila folder in his gloved hand. Olivia stopped a few feet away, completely confused by his cold, rigid posture. She began aggressively whining, complaining that I had lost my mind and illegally thrown them out onto the freezing street. She demanded Jamal yell at the police officers and force them to let her back inside the house. Jamal held up his hand, silencing her instantly. His expression was a mask of absolute professional detachment. He looked at her with an intense level of disgust that made her physically step backward. He spoke in a loud, clear voice, ensuring Bradley and Brenda heard every single word. He stated he was not there to act as their personal chauffeur. He explained that after he left the garage earlier that afternoon, the name N Vanguard LLC kept repeating in his mind. As a senior financial auditor for a top-tier accounting firm, his entire career was built on recognizing hidden corporate structures and following the money. He turned his sharp gaze toward Bradley, who was still kneeling on the frozen grass. Jamal revealed that he had gone straight to his office and conducted a quiet backdoor financial audit using public commercial registries and corporate tax filings. He announced that it took him less than an hour to map out the entire corporate architecture of my supply chain empire. He loudly declared to the freezing family that Nora was not a struggling freelancer, but a self-made multimillionaire. He exposed the massive shadow transfers, the ghost deposits, and the corporate trust accounts I had used to artificially inflate Bradley's fake lifestyle for the last 5 years. Jamal shook his head, looking down at the ruined director of sales. He told Bradley he was the most pathetic man he had ever met. He stated that Bradley had spent half a decade aggressively biting the exact hand that was secretly feeding him, paying his luxury car leases, and keeping him entirely out of bankruptcy court. Jamal expressed his absolute horror at watching this family relentlessly abuse and mock the very woman who was quietly subsidizing their entire arrogant existence. Then Jamal turned his full attention back to Olivia. He stepped forward and held out the thick manila folder. Olivia stared at it, her hands shaking violently from the freezing cold and the sudden terrifying realization of what was happening. Jamal firmly stated that he had spent his entire adult life building a spotless professional reputation in the financial sector. He told her he absolutely refused to have his good name tied to a toxic family of frauds and criminals. He reminded her that he had explicitly warned her about committing a felony by changing the locks and destroying private property. He pushed the folder directly into her trembling hands. He announced that those were formal legal separation papers drafted by his attorney just a few hours ago. He stated he was filing for an immediate divorce. He told Olivia she had 30 days to remove her personal belongings from his apartment and that all future communication would go strictly through his legal representation. Olivia let out a piercing scream of pure desperation. She grabbed his coat, begging him to reconsider, promising she would apologize to me and make everything right. Jamal easily peeled her cold hands off his jacket entirely, unmoved by her sudden fake remorse. He coldly told her she was only sorry because she ended up standing on a freezing street corner with a pile of garbage bags. Jamal turned away from his weeping wife and looked directly at me, standing near the driveway. He offered me a slow, deeply respectful nod, acknowledging the absolute masterpiece of a trap I had flawlessly executed. I nodded back, acknowledging his unbreakable integrity. He climbed into his warm SUV, put the vehicle in drive, and smoothly pulled away from the curb. The red taillights faded into the dark winter night, leaving Olivia collapsed on the freezing concrete right next to her completely ruined brother and her hysterical mother. The freezing winter wind howled down the empty suburban street, whipping fiercely against Bradley's expensive custom-tailored suit. He remained planted on his knees, staring blankly at the frosted concrete. The realization of his complete and absolute financial ruin washed over him like a bucket of ice water. He picked up his cracked cell phone with numb fingers and desperately opened his mobile banking application one last time. He blindly hoped that maybe his final corporate paycheck had cleared early or that some miraculous computer error had occurred. The glowing screen offered zero comfort. His checking account was heavily overdrawn, sitting at -$400 due to mounting overdraft fees. His credit utilization was entirely maxed out across every single piece of plastic he owned. He had absolutely zero liquid cash, no emergency savings, and no hidden safety nets left to catch him. For 5 years, he had walked around believing he was a brilliant corporate titan. He thought his sheer talent and hard work had afforded him a $2 million estate, luxury vehicles, and a lavish lifestyle. But kneeling in the freezing snow, he finally understood the humiliating truth. He was never a self-made success story. He was a heavily subsidized charity case. Every expensive meal, every tailored suit, and every country club membership had been quietly funded by the very woman he had relentlessly mocked. He had violently kicked away his golden ticket simply because his fragile masculine ego demanded he feel superior. He forced me to sign a strict roommate contract, completely unaware he was drafting his own financial death warrant. Brenda suddenly broke the heavy silence. The woman who had spent the entire evening bragging about her highly successful son suddenly turned on him with the vicious speed of a starving animal. She dropped her black garbage bags onto the freezing sidewalk and began screaming directly into his face. She demanded to know how he could be so incredibly stupid. She shrieked that she had officially terminated her luxury apartment lease because he explicitly promised she could live in the Grand Master Suite forever. She blamed him entirely for her current homelessness, loudly declaring that he was a massive disappointment. The unconditional motherly love she constantly paraded in front of me evaporated the exact second the money stopped flowing. She was a narcissist who only valued him when he was a highly profitable asset. Bradley looked up at his mother, his eyes filled with desperate panic. He begged her to calm down, asking if she had any money in her checking account to rent them a cheap motel room for the night. Brenda scoffed loudly, crossing her arms tight against her chest to block the winter chill. She viciously reminded him that her account was completely empty because his monthly allowance check had bounced days ago. She looked at him with sheer, unadulterated disgust, completely abandoning the son she had worshipped just an hour prior. Olivia did not bother sticking around to watch the pathetic family argument unfold. She aggressively grabbed her cracked plastic laundry basket and began dragging her belongings down the street toward the main intersection. Bradley called out to his sister, begging her to wait and asking if they could come stay at her apartment for the weekend. Olivia did not even turn her head. She yelled back over her shoulder that Jamal was changing the locks in the morning and she was currently heading to a friend's couch. She explicitly told Bradley not to call her, stating she had her own ruined life to deal with thanks to his arrogant stupidity. She rounded the corner and completely disappeared into the dark winter night, abandoning her own flesh and blood without a single ounce of hesitation. Bradley was left entirely alone with his shrieking mother on a freezing public sidewalk. He slowly stood up, brushing the wet snow off the knees of his ruined suit. He turned his head and looked back at the massive, beautiful estate he had once proudly called his own. The grand bay windows glowed with a warm, inviting light, completely contrasting the bitter cold reality of the street. He could clearly see the silhouette of the private security guard standing firmly inside the grand foyer, ensuring he could never return. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his heavy metal car keys. His luxury-leased sports car was currently parked on the street a few yards away. He walked toward the vehicle, hoping to at least use the heater to survive the freezing night. But as he approached, a heavy tow truck with flashing yellow lights pulled up right alongside it. Because I had permanently canceled the ghost payments, the massive lease was severely past due. The repossession agent hooked up the sports car without saying a single word. Bradley just stood there shivering in the snow, watching his absolute final asset get dragged away into the dark. I turned my back on the pathetic scene unfolding on the sidewalk and walked steadily back up my long stone driveway. The flashing yellow lights of the tow truck disappeared around the corner, taking the very last piece of Bradley's fake billionaire persona with it. I approached the heavy front door and nodded to the private security guard stationed in the grand foyer. He stepped aside respectfully, allowing me to re-enter my own beautiful home. Within 20 minutes, the professional commercial locksmith I had scheduled earlier that afternoon arrived. He efficiently removed the cheap shiny brass deadbolt Olivia and Brenda had illegally installed and replaced it with a state-of-the-art biometric security system. I registered my fingerprint, feeling a profound sense of absolute finality as the heavy steel bolts slammed firmly into place. The house was officially an impenetrable fortress again, my peaceful fortress. I walked slowly through the grand first floor, surveying the aftermath of the abruptly cancelled holiday party. The catering staff had left the kitchen in pristine condition aside from the massive roasted turkey sitting abandoned on the marble island. I simply picked up the heavy silver platter and slid the entire bird directly into the oversized garbage bin. I had absolutely no desire to consume a meal prepared for a celebration of my supposed downfall. I walked over to the custom-built wine cellar and selected a rare vintage red wine. It was a bottle Bradley had constantly begged to open for his arrogant corporate friends, but I had always insisted on saving it for a truly special occasion. Tonight was undoubtedly that occasion. I poured a generous measure into a crystal glass, taking a slow, deep sip. The rich, bold flavor tasted exactly like absolute freedom. I carried my glass into the living room and sat down on the expensive Italian leather sofa. The house was incredibly quiet. For 5 long years, I had intentionally shrunk myself to fit inside the tiny, fragile box of Bradley's masculine ego. I had dimmed my own brilliant light, hidden my massive corporate success, and endured endless verbal abuse from his toxic family just to maintain the illusion of a happy traditional marriage. I had convinced myself that playing the quiet, supportive wife was the right thing to do to protect his pride. But staring out the grand bay windows into the dark winter night, I finally understood the brutal truth. You can never build a healthy life with someone who requires you to be small just so they can feel tall. Bradley did not love me. He loved the immense comfort and unearned status I silently provided. The moment he believed he had the upper hand, he did not hesitate to completely destroy me. He demanded strict financial independence, assuming it would break my spirit. Instead, it handed me the exact legal weapon I needed to completely dismantle his entire arrogant existence. Financial independence is not just about having money in a bank account. It is about having the absolute, unyielding power to walk away from any table where respect is no longer being served. It is about establishing brutal, ironclad boundaries and fiercely defending your peace against anyone who attempts to cross them. I let Bradley and his awful family cross my boundaries for years because I wanted to keep the peace. But true peace is never found by negotiating with emotional terrorists. It is found by completely cutting off their supply. In the weeks that followed, Bradley attempted to fight the divorce, but his high-priced attorney immediately dropped him the second his retainer check bounced. Without his massive corporate salary, he was forced to represent himself in family court. The judge took one look at our strict 50-50 roommate agreement and the Vanguard LLC corporate ownership documents and completely threw out his ridiculous demands for equity and spousal support. He currently lives in a tiny studio apartment on the other side of the city, working a low-level retail job to pay off his massive credit card debts. Jamal successfully finalized his divorce from Olivia, and we occasionally meet for coffee to discuss corporate investment strategies. As for me, I am thriving. Vanguard continues to dominate the commercial supply chain industry, and my home is finally the peaceful sanctuary it was always meant to be. I no longer hide my success or apologize for my ambition. I wear my power proudly. If you are watching this and you are currently shrinking yourself to keep a toxic partner or a manipulative family comfortable, please hear my words. Stop hiding your brilliance. Draw your brutal boundaries and defend them fiercely. The right people will celebrate your strength, not punish you for it. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic relationship to reclaim your own power? Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of absolute resilience and ultimate revenge. Thank you for watching, and remember to always know your worth. The story of Nora and Bradley offers a profound lesson on the devastating cost of shrinking yourself to protect the fragile ego of a toxic partner. For years, Nora operated under the misguided belief that hiding her immense success and quietly subsidizing Bradley's lavish lifestyle would somehow maintain peace in her marriage. She dimmed her own brilliant light so his artificial one could shine brighter. But this sacrifice did not earn her respect or gratitude. Instead, it bred a monster of entitlement. Bradley became convinced of his own supremacy and felt entirely justified in humiliating her because he falsely believed he held all the financial power. The ultimate realization here is that true peace is never achieved by negotiating with people who actively disrespect you. When you continuously rescue someone from the consequences of their own arrogance, you are not helping them grow. You are simply funding your own mistreatment. Nora's massive turning point came not when she matched his anger with more anger, but when she simply stopped playing the role of his invisible safety net. She enacted the exact financial independence he arrogantly demanded and allowed the natural consequences of his extreme ignorance to completely dismantle his life. This teaches us that boundaries are not just emotional constructs. They are the practical mechanisms of our absolute survival. Your worth is not defined by how much abuse you can quietly endure to keep a toxic household together. It is defined by your willingness to walk away from any table where respect is no longer being served. You must never apologize for your ambition or hide your capabilities to make someone else feel adequately important. Please share your own personal experiences in the comments section down below and let me know how you confidently enforce your personal boundaries starting today.